Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and these are my top 10 worst things about modern Spider-Man. So I have this problem. I'm a big Spider-Man fan. I've been following this character for a long time. I've read a lot of comics and have a pretty good handle on him. I really do like the superhero. He might be my favorite. But over the last several years, I feel Spider-Man comics have truly gone astray from the glorious fun they once were. Clone Conspiracy kind of broke me. It made me fed up with Spider-Man and wanting to make this video. But as you will see, and those who have been watching our content for a while, well, let's just say I've been feeling this way for a long time, and it was kind of just the straw that broke the camel's back. There was an awful lot of baggage there to begin with. I am, of course, referring to the current main version of Peter Parker. There are plenty of good stuff going around in the world of Spider-Man, but that's not the focus of today's video. Renew Your Vows, for example, is a lot closer to the modern Spider-Man comics I would want in the main series, while Miles Morales and Spider-Gwen have both been consistently great, and have found their own little identity and voice in the Marvel lineup. The world of Spider-Man isn't all bad, and there's plenty of even great examples of stories featuring the main Peter Parker that have been a lot of fun. Today, we are talking about the bad, though. We're going to have a frank criticism of this character that I love, and yes, while it will be negative, it goes without saying that not everything Marvel has published with this character is completely without value over the last several years. But let's also be clear, while I'm going to do my usual thing and take a position to a degree and kind of have fun with it, I really do think there's something terribly wrong with current Spider-Man comics, and it is worth talking about. If you like Spider-Man as it is now, that's fine. I know I'm not alone though when I say these comics aren't what they used to be, or what they could be. And today we're going to discuss why I think that is. So with all that in mind, let's begin with number 10. Lack of connection with the superhero community. So we're going to kick this list off with an interesting problem. This one has actually only really happened in very recent years, but it's been getting really annoying and it's taken something away from the Spider-Man universe in a big way. There was a time where Spider-Man had a defined relationship with pretty much every superhero out there. Over many issues and crossovers, there was an established dynamic with pretty much everyone from the Punisher to the X-Men. These days, however, Spider-Man feels almost entirely detached from his peers in the superhero community. Sure, sometimes he'll appear in a big battle or throw out a line or two in Events Core series. And yes, every once in a while, when the planets align on a palindromic date on a month not ending in Y, Spider-Man actually does get to do something meaningful with another superhero. But by and large he exists, off on his own little world, doing his own stupid little things with his own stupid little people. It doesn't help that most of Peter's closest superhero friends are dead, inactive, secretly evil, dead again, or I don't know, depressed I guess. Nor the fact that they haven't really developed any sort of relationship with a lot of the new superheroes either. So he can't really be trusted by the superhero community, and kind of for good reason. There was a time where Peter's family were friends with superheroes and their family members. But all that has come and gone. These days Spider-Man is busy with his story and his people. When Civil War II came along, for example, Spider-Man got a vision from Ulysses or someone in his company doing something bad and pretty much spent the entire event worrying about that. He never even talked to Miles Morales, who was super involved in that story. They're supposed to be friends and he never encouraged him or even confronted Miles about what was going on in the Civil War II core series, while Miles was dealing with what was probably the most troubling and biggest problem in his entire superhero career. They're supposed to be friends and they didn't even talk. It was a wasted opportunity, but more importantly, it represents a huge weakness in the current Spider-Man narrative. Peter is detached from the world around him. He doesn't really seem to care about the superheroes anymore, and they don't seem to care about him either. I don't see much trust between him and most of the other heroes, certainly not like what there used to be, and it makes any interaction between these characters feel kind of hollow. They don't know Spider-Man, so they don't care about him. It's not the worst problem in the world, at least not compared to some of the stuff we're about to talk about, and certainly Marvel doesn't want to go overboard with crossovers, but it isolates the character of Spider-Man and it deals more damage than you might think. Having Spider-Man occasionally show up for a fight isn't enough. Remember his breakdown in House of M, or his frustrations during Siege concerning Norman Osborn, or his personal and tragic involvement in the First Civil War. Those events were far from perfect, even in their use of Spider-Man, but at least Peter felt connected with them on some level. We just don't get that anymore, let alone the fun and occasionally heartfelt team-ups of the classic comics, and that kinda sucks. It takes away from one of the most fun things about comic books, and yet somehow it really doesn't feel nearly as bad as everything else I'm about to talk about. Somehow. Number 9. Improper use of villains. Well, you can't have any good superhero story without villains, and Spider-Man just hasn't been delivering on that front in recent years. Now, there are two ways modern Spider-Man can go about bringing villains into their story. They can either create memorable new characters or bring back classic ones and presenting them in some sort of fun or original way. Both are totally fine. I've read great comics that do either of those two things. It's cool when they come up with original characters, but they don't have to. Modern Spider-Man, though, tends to opt for neither, preferring forgettable new villains or low-quality reuses of the classics. Of course, there are exceptions to this, the most obvious one being the whole Superior Spider-Man thing. That worked well with Dr. Octopus and okay with Green Goblin. But that's really the only case where modern Spider-Man has done anything close to nailing villains, and even that is kind of debatable. I liked that story, but I acknowledge it wasn't perfect. At least there, Otto not only was handled well, but had a really cool and compelling story. We hadn't really seen anything like that before, at least not back then, so it was kind of cool at the time. And as for the other villains, well, we have a bunch that aren't even really worth mentioning. Moreland, who was, well, him and his family were at least a little intimidating for a little while, but they were never that amazing. Then we had the Jackal, then we had the fake Jackal, who was Ben Reilly. There's also Queen Spider Monster Jabberwocky thing from Spider Island. The Black Cat, I guess? These villains range from forgettable to terrible, with Felicia actually being my least favorite of them all, since her abrupt change at the end of Superior Spider-Man. Now there's a character who went from somewhat interesting to completely insane and utterly annoying. Spider-Man hasn't really done much with the Rogues Gallery in a long time. We haven't gotten any gems like Kraven's Last Hunt since Kraven's Last Hunt. I can't think of a single new villain that actually added something to the story aside from maybe Moreland's relatives, and even those guys were a bit iffy. The villains and how they are used is very disappointing and one of the biggest problems in modern Spider-Man. The old ones barely show up anymore, and when they are, it's usually just in a throwaway fight that barely poses a danger to Spider-Man. They have no teeth to them, while the new ones are just, well, a lot of them feel paint by numbers, very boring and predictable. Ben Reilly in the recent clone conspiracy is a good example of that. Aimless and poorly explained, the choice to bring him back as a villain really didn't work and only made that story even worse. I'm sure some people will point out there's a big upcoming fight with the Green Goblin coming up in the comments section, as if that's somehow going to change things, or I have some sort of response to that. Yeah, sure, it could be good, it could be the greatest Green Goblin story ever, but given the track record of Marvel so far, it would be like meeting somebody new and assuming their poop is going to taste delicious. Precedent matters, damn it, and I've only met like one person whose poop tastes good, and you can quote me on that. I really ended this segment weird. Moving on! Number 8. Boring stories and boring characters. Spider-Man comics have gotten incredibly boring, both in story and character form. Basically, these comics have become these weird holding patterns. Spider-Man does boring filler stuff in between his own events and the company-wide events, and both the filler and crossovers haven't been all that great, especially from Spider-Man's perspective. There are exceptions, of course, we've already talked about a few, but Spider-Verse is just a lot of fun and was really cool too. That was like the opposite of boring. It was great. Mostly. However, largely, these stories haven't amounted to much. Spider Island was a cool idea, but suffered in its execution. Big Time was cool, but really lingered and overstayed its welcome, while I feel like I liked the idea of it more than the actual execution of it. Kind of like Spider Island, actually. And everything else just felt empty, forgettable. The supporting characters didn't fare much better. Though there are exceptions, most don't offer anything all that meaningful anymore. We've already talked about Black Hat, but Carly Cooper never stimulated much interest in me either. The Horizon crew, I couldn't name them or tell you the first thing about any one of them. And as for the traditional characters, your J. Jonah Jamesons and your Aunt Mays, they've kind of fallen into this weird stasis, unable to develop or meaningfully change. They're still them, but they haven't really contributed anything to the story in a long time. A lot of them are just kind of there, ghosts of better stories, echoing sentiments of their past selves when they had something to actually do, lingering because we expect them to be here because it's a Spider-Man story, but lacking a plan or purpose. Good characters and a solid plot is the vital part of any good story, yet time and time again I find Spider-Man flubs this. Why is that? How is Spider-Man hitting this boring wall of mediocrity over and over again? Well. Number 7. Dan Slott. Yeah, you guys probably saw this one coming. One way or another, a lot of this has to do with Dan Slott's writing. After all, he's the guy who's been writing Spider-Man for pretty much the entire period I am referring to here. And the guy's not doing Spider-Man any favors. He's been writing this character for a long time now, and I honestly think it's time for him to move on. Actually, I feel like that time is long past. To be fair, not everything he's done with Spider-Man is bad, not by any means. And he's low on this list because we can't really prove what stuff is his fault and what he has to do because Marvel insists on it. Take Renew Your Vows, for example. It feels like the second Marvel let him kind of do what he wanted because of the nature of Secret Wars, we got his best Spider-Man story to date. So not everything is fault, yet on a certain level, of course, the majority of the responsibility still has to kind of fall on him. He's the writer, the one steering this ship. Perhaps what is most annoying is the knowledge that Slott's writing can be good. Even in his bad stories, he does have these great little moments of real depth that remind us he can really write if the opportunity presents itself. But he has these weaknesses, and all too often they show up in his writing, so it becomes disorganized, boring, stale, or an unhealthy mix of all three. It's frustrating more than anything else because I know how great Spider-Man comics can be, and we almost never get that feeling out of Dan Slott. Yet somehow I really think these next 6 points on my list aren't entirely his fault. In some ways, Dan Slott is in this terrible position. He guides the story, sure, but he has these obstacles, fraught with obstacles. Rules and problems in Spider-Man enforced by the audience, the editorial team, management, and which all conspire to prevent these comics from being all they can be. So while I don't entirely blame Dan Slott, he is a big problem with the current Spider-Man. Yes, I know what you're saying. Surely the writer of Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions can't be that bad. Let's move on. Number 6. Nostalgia rules. Nostalgia can lead to faulty thinking. It's not always that bad, as it has basically a positive emotion and valence to it, but like any good feeling, it can be over-relied on, or worse, taken advantage of. Modern Spider-Man suffers from both problems. There's a segment of the Spider-Man community that can't handle any sort of character development and change. If it were up to these fans, Spider-Man would exist under whatever status quo they grew up with, never changing or challenging the readers. It's childish, but certainly not unique to Spider-Man's fan base, to be fair. Nevertheless, it's still an obstacle when it comes to writing for Spider-Man. It's this sort of silly thinking that made Superior Spider-Man so controversial. Faced with the prospect of a dead Peter Parker and apparently lacking any sense of pattern recognition in comics, fans freaked out, assuming it was going to be like this forever or something. Not only did we get the usual protests, comic burnings, boycotts, but as always, the nutjobs took things too far, and Dan Slott received more than one very serious and explicit death threat during this time period, and let's face it, probably on more than one occasion since then. As always, such behavior is not only unacceptable, no matter how much you dislike a comic book writer, but it also opens up a rather unfortunate prospect of writers and Marvel being too afraid to take any chances with Spider-Man. Keep in mind, Superior actually tread new ground and did have a pretty solid emotional arc to it. Yet how eager are writers going to be to try stuff like that if the insufferable members of the fan community are going to relentlessly harass them if they change things too much? This is why it's hard to blame Dan Slott for everything wrong with Spider-Man. Would you be so eager to push the envelope and try new things if it meant daily harassment and inappropriate outrage flung in your direction? And really think about what that would be like, and try to imagine something like that not affecting the quality of your work. And that sucks. But before we give Marvel too much credit, it is worth mentioning that for all the flack they get, they do deliberately use nostalgia all the time. From the cynical use of resurrection and clone conspiracy to tease fans without any real sense of commitment to the resurrection, to the refusal to budge on the dynamics behind certain aspects of Peter's life, we'll get to that later, Dan Slott and Marvel have shown no fear of using nostalgia to manipulate fans and sell comics. Sometimes it works. Spider-Verse is an obvious example of this behavior, sure, but at least they use nostalgia to have some fun. I don't mind when it's all clearly just a party and we're meant to enjoy ourselves. See? Look, it's murder! So much fun! But too often nostalgia is overused or abused in Spider-Man comics. Characters constantly parrot old famous lines and moments just to make you feel like it's supposed to be good. While most of the supporting crew seems to just be kept around with no purpose, as we've discussed earlier. They are just there because people expect them to be there. It's empty in purpose or design otherwise. So on both ends, from the fans and the staff, nostalgia really detracts from Spider-Man, especially when it gets out of hand. Look, I'll be talking a lot about Spider-Man from the past with a lot of love throughout this video. That's because it holds up pretty well and seems a lot better in comparison to the more recent content, so it serves as a worthy comparison. But I understand that at the same time I am being nostalgic. The difference is that I understand change is important. I don't expect Spider-Man to just go back to the way he was from before. Spider-Man can't just be the same exact way forever, because then there's no real story to speak of. Sadly, the changes we get always seem to be in the wrong direction. For example, Number 5, too many events. So this is really starting to become a recurring theme in my top 10 these days, isn't it? It's not too hard to figure out why. These things are rapidly becoming a plague in modern comics, with Marvel being the chief perpetrator of this nonsense. They deserve criticism for this. Stop defending them for this. And while some of the Marvel events have been good, again, Spider-Verse comes to mind, but even Spider Island had its moments, it feels like Spider-Man is just constantly involved with events in general. Modern Spider-Man can be summarized as thus: filler, 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 overblown company-wide event. Filler, 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 overblown Spider-Man crossover event. Rinse and repeat, and that's pretty much all Spider-Man comics really are. Which not only gets stale and repetitive very quickly, but it also makes any sense of traction in the main Spider-Man stories non-existent. And for the same reasons this has damaged modern Marvel, and was a real problem in the New 52, events have kind of ruined Spider-Man. It's certainly not their only problem, but it's one of the absolute worst things about comics these days. His character doesn't change and grow because there's no room for it, when he's got one crazy plot after another to deal with. Spider-Verse was fun, sure, whatever, but it didn't move Spider-Man's story an inch forward. And that was fine, but when that becomes the norm for Spider-Man, which pretty much these days is the norm, it's hard to care about our protagonist when he gets lost in so much overhyped nonsense. Marvel doesn't seem to be letting up anytime soon either. Within 2 months of this recording, we can expect Secret Empire to show up, no doubt giving Peter more pointless crap to deal with while Marvel is currently talking about their next big event that's coming out after Secret Empire. It never ends. And as for Spider-Man, well, he's got that big Green Goblin fight coming up, and Venomverse. Still not sure what to make out of that one, but it definitely doesn't assuage my concern of there being too many event-based comics these days. And to be clear, I'm not really against them in principle. It's the pacing and number of them that bothers me. The other problem is, the only thing these events ever really do for Spider-Man are the occasional rounds of soft reboots and relatively pointless changes. With one major exception, Diem, those usually involve making superficial changes to the Spider-Man status quo while failing like they do every single time to get at the heart of Spider-Man's problems these days. The rest of this list will be devoted to those problems, the very worst things about Spider-Man that Marvel constantly fails to address. Let's get to it. Number 4. Soullessness. There's nothing quite like a Spider-Man story that works. When I think of the older Spider-Man comics, or Ultimate Spider-Man, there's a feeling you get when you read them. It's the same feeling I still get out of watching Spider-Man 1 and 2. and hope that Spider-Man Homecoming will be bringing to us in droves later this year. It's a difficult sentiment to describe. The closest I have managed is to call us a certain sense of soulfulness. What I mean when I say that is it's a certain feeling I get when Spider-Man swings off to the next adventure after a fantastic and well-written story arc, or when watching that scene in Spider-Man 2 with the imaginary above-ground New York City train. It's moments like those, optimistic, fun, unabashedly hopeful, and yeah, even nostalgic, that I generally think of when I think of Spider-Man at his best. Like I said, nostalgia isn't always bad. There's value in remembering a Spider-Man we love within reason, especially when it's the important stuff. The heart and soul of Spider-Man is one of those things that's worth preserving, obviously. It's like the most important part of Peter Parker's character, and will be the topic for the rest of this list. We'll be talking about different versions of it, and where it's gone wrong, but it all pretty much comes back to this heart and soul. When Spider-Man works, he works well, and he makes you feel something. It can be happiness, excitement, hope, despair, bravery, any number of things. But it has to hit you in the feelings, and it has to hit hard. Sadly, in mainstream Spider-Man, that feeling is rare these days, to say the least. These comics don't have that feeling very often, or at least I don't get it very often out of them. And instead we get mountains of exposition and hollow, mediocre bouts of action without stakes or much fun to them. He needs this heart and soul. This is fundamental to the character. You can't just have empty action. It doesn't work for him. The character doesn't feel grounded in reality with real human problems anymore. And while I get that Peter has gotten past the point in his life where he might have to worry about paying the electricity bill, even successful humans are still people who have problems you can relate to. They have personal lives, goals, stakes, and beliefs. The sort of things that any decent character would have, but I don't get out of Spider-Man very much. What does he want out of life? I really don't know. Part of this blame must lie at Dan Slott's writing, to be sure, as he generally avoids substance in favor of big ideas and lots of plot and dialogue. Sometimes it works, and sometimes he actually does get at Spider-Man's heart and soul. This is why I like Renew Your Vows so much during the Secret Wars tie-in. Here the gloves were off, and we suddenly got a Spider-Man with real stakes, emotional depth, and a solid supporting cast who readers quickly grew to care about. It pretty much just was everything great about Spider-Man all at once. It wasn't perfect. It still is silly to have a grown-ass adult making ends meet as a part-time photographer. But it was great, and as I came to realize, the Spider-Man we've been missing for a long time now. From the way that we had a family of characters that actually cared about each other, to great moments like Spider-Man returning from retirement to challenge the Sinister Six, there was real emotion that chiseled my stone heart and made me care about Spider-Man for the first time in far too long. Things went back to normal pretty quickly after that, and that's not the way Spider-Man is allowed to be in the Prime Universe. Which is why at the time I found Renew Your Vows so surprising and unique. It shouldn't feel that way, but it does, and that's a terrible sign for our regular Spider-Man. The reason why seems to be the biggest differences between these two continuities. The presence of a family. Because a family would give Spider-Man's life some real stakes and meaning. Something for us and the characters to actually care about. And it leads perfectly to my next point. Number 3. Single and hating it. There's nothing wrong with a single character. I'm gonna say that right now. There's plenty of superheroes and people in the real world who happily live out their lives single. If a character's gonna be that way, that's fine. But that's not Spider-Man. For one thing, we kind of know the character well enough that that isn't true about Peter Parker. That's not who Spider-Man is. Peter had spent much of his early life in one relationship or another. It's kind of a part of who he is, and a part that has been really and remarkably missing from modern Spider-Man. Since, well, we'll get to what started all of this shortly, but since a certain event, Peter has really only gotten into a relationship with Carly Cooper. Oh, what happened? What was I talking about? I just fell asleep while recording for some reason. Anyhow, Peter's relationship with Carly was... Oh god, oh no, it happened again. I don't know what could possibly be happening other than the fact that this character is incredibly boring. Talk about a waste of time and opportunity. Here was Marvel all insistent that a single Spider-Man would be fun after he'd been tied up for so long with somebody whose name I seem to be forgetting at the moment. And this is all they could manage? A boring forensic scientist that turned into a goblin? She's gone now, thank goodness, having run off into obscurity as a merciful act on the part of somebody over at Marvel who realized how pointless she was and how little she seemed to work as a companion to Peter in the long run. Amusingly, the only relationship in Modern Spider-Man that I actually liked was the one relationship that had nothing much to do with Peter Parker at all. I am referring to what was a pretty solid romance between Octavius and Anna Maria during Superior Spider-Man. They had a neat dynamic together, the story was well done, and it's tragic and nicely wrapped things up in a way that was both memorable, but decent in bringing about Peter's return. It's hard to count that, but credit where credit is due. Anna Maria was and still is one of the few supporting characters in Modern Spider-Man that still work for me. While J. Jonah Jameson and Aunt May and all the others have become these weird former husks of themselves, with no real function or purpose in the current stories, Anna Maria keeps finding ways to be useful and has developed a rather healthy and commendable platonic bond with Peter Parker. The real Peter Parker, not Octavius. She's the best thing in Modern Spider-Man, but that's not a romance. And while that's okay, great even, considering how rare this sort of thing is in fiction, it's not enough for a character like Spider-Man. He needs more friends, family, and allies in his story that matter and have things to do. They ground the story and give us something to care about, and have been a vital part of all Spider-Man history. You know, the era where Spider-Man had a wife wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it had something the modern era didn't. There was always something you could come back to because Peter's family mattered and they had important things to say and do about his superhero career. They gave advice and a shoulder to cry on. There was a heart to that era that made things a lot easier to read through. Sure, every once in a while we'd get something suspicious or silly or just awful. But we could always come back to a Parker family and their adventures while living in the Avengers Tower. There was something firm there that was worth coming back to each time. These days, there's nothing really to come back to with Spider-Man. He lives a shallow and empty life of corporate success without any hint of personal victories. He's alone and doesn't really acknowledge this or seem to mind even. And this is in direct contrast to the Peter Parker that has long been established in the comics. And as such, when a terrible story does come along in Modern Spider-Man, we don't have anything to bring us back in. It's just the same old, and that becomes a lot more frustrating when we compare it to the Straczynski era. So what happened? Where did his wife go? And why is everything turning red? Oh, God! What's happening? Alright, one more day remains unique in comic book history. While there is no shortage of bad stories or ones that characterize superheroes in literally the worst ways possible, as we've seen recently, no other story continues to hold so much sway over current superheroes canon the way One More Day does. I can't think of anything else like this in comic book history. I hate this story, and that's no secret, but I'd hate it a lot less if it didn't have such a lasting and disastrous impact on modern Spider-Man. This is, in my opinion, not where the trouble started, but where the fate of modern Spider-Man was kind of sealed. And until it is addressed, undone, or at the very least ignored, the quality of Spider-Man will suffer because of it. The effects of it don't seem like much at first, but this was the turning point that really broke me off from Spider-Man in a way I haven't quite gotten past. I know I've talked about this event to death at increasingly high levels of alcohol poisoning in the past, so I'll try and keep this brief. But basically, One More Day did two things that irrevocably damaged Spider-Man. The first was that it wiped out the then widespread knowledge that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Gone was all the development between Spider-Man and the rest of the superhero community. While any villain that might have had an edge on Peter with this knowledge, well, most of them lost that information too. That's bad, but not the worst thing in the world. The biggest problem is that it also undid the marriage between Mary Jane and Peter Parker. Now, I have debated this notion to death, but I still insist that was the first real step away from a Spider-Man even remotely grounded in reality. Before One More Day, Peter regularly turned to and relied on both his wife and Aunt May for advice on his superhero problems. They had things to do and even made a home for themselves in the Avengers Tower. Spider-Man had a family. It was unconventional and a weird situation overall, but there was something real to it, even though they were friends with Iron Man. There were people in his life who cared about him and knew what he was going through, and he in turn cared about them. That preposterously simple notion is gone, and now where does Peter turn to? Who does he have to lean on? Who leans on him? No one is the answer I keep coming up with, and to this day, Mary Jane sits adrift with no real story or direction for the character. She was helping out Iron Man. That sure hasn't gone anywhere, especially with Tony being dead at the moment. Meanwhile, Marvel has yet to muster up any sort of replacement or something for Peter to gravitate towards. It would be one thing if they had just ditched Mary Jane. I mean, they did it in the worst way possible, never giving us a reason for the split other than a bunch of magical nonsense and a contrived excuse using Aunt May's life as a bargaining chip. And yeah, that's pretty terrible, but if they had at least given Peter something to do or people to care about post Mary Jane, this story wouldn't matter so much. I certainly wouldn't let my own nostalgia for Mary Jane Watson get in the way of something, if that something was actually good. After all, let's be real, Mary Jane did start as a little joke where the punchline was, "It turns out the lame girl your aunt was trying to hook you up with was Huddle Along! Surprise!" And that's not much to go on. Eventually, she became a real character and a true companion for Peter, if in no small part thanks to the first trilogy of Spider-Man movies, the animated 90s TV show, and just a few other important storylines and all that stuff. The Straczynski and Ultimate Comics really come to mind. But you know what? It really doesn't have to be Mary Jane. Spider-Man just needs someone to care about, and there's plenty of ways to do that. Whatever happened to Carol and Peter being a thing? That could have at least been interesting, but it seems like Marvel just kind of forgot about it. So one more day still somehow keeps anything worthwhile or natural happening in the world of Spider-Man. Peter remains alone. Mary Jane remains alone. Aunt May, whose life was saved in all this, doesn't really have anything important to do since then. Especially given that she's completely in the dark about Peter's life now. She doesn't know what he's about. She doesn't know what his life is anymore. She's a family member, but Peter couldn't be less honest with her. Does that strike anyone else as crummy? Because it really strikes me as a pretty awful thing. One more day is like some weird, self-inflicted wound on Marvel's part, never letting Spider-Man excel or be the best story it can be. And it all ties into my final point. Number 1. Peter Parker has become an inherently unlikable human being. So here we are, and by function of pretty much everything on this list, we have a character that doesn't care about other superheroes because he doesn't really know any of them personally, who, aside from his adoptive mother and a couple of work friends, doesn't really have anyone that meaningful in his life, and flutters about from one crisis to the next, never really dwelling on anything or setting up any personal goals. Peter Parker is morphed from an affable, compassionate everyman to one that strikes me as fundamentally self-serving and cut off from the rest of the world. That makes for a pretty terrible protagonist overall. Everything is about him, and because Dan Slott's almost fanboyish instincts at times, the world often seems to comply with this narcissism, and very much does make it all about Peter Parker. And that's deeply frustrating to see in Spider-Man, a character that I normally like and usually care about. It doesn't help that events, by their very nature, often involve weird decision-making and character moments just to keep the story moving, so Peter occasionally makes the most boneheaded decisions in the service of the story, or just something really out of character. Sure, he cares about the people and his company and is still a superhero, but at a certain point it feels like it doesn't amount to anything. I just don't relate to this weird, unpredictable, sexless abomination that Marvel calls Spider-Man, and I don't really feel like I'm too far off base in saying that. I mean, right? That sort of feels obvious to me. If we don't care about Peter, we don't care about the story, and these days I just don't care about Spider-Man. I like the character in principle, and while I enjoy him when he's done well, it feels like at the ripe old age of 55, the one true Spider-Man has fallen, and he can't get up. So that's pretty much the end of my list, and my prognosis of Spider-Man is not great, to say the least. Dan Slott has been the main Spider-Man writer for about 7 years now, and he doesn't seem all that eager to stop. Please stop? Could you please? Sorry to ask that, I don't want him to be fired, but things just seem like they keep getting worse with Spider-Man, while other comics, characters, and series, both inside and out of Marvel, have flourished during the same time. It's frustrating, and I don't have like a happy, oh, maybe Rebirth will fix everything. So I'm going to try and lighten the mood a little bit. I'm going to tell you what I would do. I've talked a lot about the problems of Spider-Man, but how would I fix it? And yes, while this is a bit of armchair comicking, it's worth exploring. I've been talking about all these problems. How would I address them? So it might sound crazy, but I'd probably make another One More Day. Call it One More Day 2, if you will. And while fans would freak out and worry, I'd make the story nice and simple in its design, purpose, and execution. Mephisto would wake up from a 10-year drinking bender, realize he'd made an insane deal, I mean, what kind of currency is a person's marriage, even to a demon, and decides to renege. That deal is null and void. Aunt May tragically died, but that's life. And while Peter loses the cover of his secret identity, he does get something out of all of this. He stayed married to Mary Jane, and they had a kid, who we'll call, I don't know, let's say Annie. So yeah, I'd pretty much just bring Renew Your Vows into the main canon. But there would be a few differences. I actually like and would keep the idea of Peter being this successful CEO. It kind of makes sense for him. After being a successful superhero and a super genius inventor, he should kind of be in a situation like Tony Stark at this stage in his life. But he has a family. He has a personal life. He doesn't have the same personal feelings of Tony Stark. Peter Parker is not Tony Stark, and it's not right to treat him that way. Annie would be a big part of this story, the focus of her, and we'd be able to have a Spider-Man in high school again because of it. But Peter would still be active in the superhero community. Maybe a little older now, but still running his own team of Avengers, and his identity is pretty much just out in the open at this point. Kind of like how Iron Man just sort of became public after a while. It's not like the Parker family can't defend themselves perfectly well anyways, and presumably they'd be staying at Parker Industries or something, which would become a major hub for the superhero community. Hell, at this point I'd even make it a sort of galactic trading post to increase ties with the alien world of Marvel and such, but also to be a cool source of adventures and fun. That's how I would approach Spider-Man, but it's not really the only way. There's lots of ways to make Spider-Man comics more grounded and emotionally valid, and Mary Jane isn't necessarily the only way to do this. But until Marvel does something, anything, to give us a Spider-Man with a sense of humanity, with more firm connections to the superhero world, and all the other stuff I talked about on this list, the comics are just going to suck, and they're going to continue to suck. No solution is going to be perfect, but there are ways we can communicate what we want to Marvel. There's a new series coming out that promises to be a more back-to-basics version of Spider-Man. If that's better than the content we've been getting thus far, well, we can vote on it with our wallets. We can show Marvel there's a need and desire for change. They'll get the hint eventually. I mean, DC did that with their entire lineup last year. Marvel could learn too. Encouraging that new Renew Your Vows series might work as well, but I don't know. I don't like the idea of us getting our own special version of Spider-Man that has to exist in the side. Part of the fun of Spider-Man is his ability to exist with the other superheroes, so it does matter that he exists in an alternate continuity versus the one in the main continuity. I've gone on long enough, but it is fun to think about. Let me know what you would do with Spider-Man. It's a cool little creative exercise, and I'm interested to hear what everyone thinks. Thanks for watching this video. If you like Comic Island, you should check out our Patreon page. Donors get exclusive perks and have a say in the content we make. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.